Well, welcome to this latest IEA In Conversation With on our YouTube channel. My name is Mark Littlewood. I am the Director General of the IEA. And I've got a very special guest back on the IEA London YouTube channel. David Davis has been a Member of Parliament since 1987 for the constituency of Haltemprice and Howden. An enormous political career spanning over 35 years, vast range of roles, including Minister of State for Europe, Shadow Home Secretary, and of course, Secretary of State for exiting the European Union, a position he resigned from in opposition to Theresa May's Chequers proposals. Keen supporter of civil liberties, low tax, capitalism, and a free market economy. I'm going to be asking David his views on the present state of the economy, and in particular tax, and whether we're going in the right or the wrong direction. So, the man, the myth, the legend, David Davis, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Great to have you back here at the IEA. Give us your spot price overview of where we're at with the economy now and the trajectory of this government, which to my mind seems to be high tax, high spending.
I'll start by offering you a contract to introduce me at every speech. But you've always got to, when you're thinking about an economic strategy or economic position, look at the surroundings, the political surroundings, the international surroundings, the structure of society and so on. At the moment, we're at a really big inflection point for all sorts of reasons. Obviously, the coronavirus crisis, both globally and also locally, because it's had obviously huge impacts on our national balance sheet. You've got the fact, which I think not many people have really noticed, that we are at the end of 30 halcyon years of global free trade. 1995, the creation of the World Trade Organization, the GATT round and all that, has led to a fantastic reduction in tariff barriers across the board. And that, of course, is probably the most important event in history in many ways. It lifted 1.5 billion people out of absolute poverty. That's coming to an end. You're seeing more protectionism. Obviously, the European Union, the Americans instinctively protectionist. You're seeing the same in East Asia and so on. So that's naturally sort of getting a bit slow. And with it, the growth rate it engendered. But it's also adding to that all the fears now of not being too dependent on other countries, whether it's for oil, gas, technology, chips, whatever it might be. And so you get a degree of economic nationalism coming back in, which reinforces that. So there's an issue to deal with there. On top of that, you've got the still ongoing, and in fact still accelerating technological revolution. I mean, it looks like it's going to keep accelerating for a decade or two, even now. And finally, of course, Brexit, which actually allows us and requires us to make some bolder moves than we have done so far. And you've hosted, I think, in the past, David Frost, who resigned because he didn't think we were doing that.
We weren't seizing the opportunity.
Which brings us to, what now? And what now is that what we ought to be doing is looking at a comparatively deregulated, not entirely deregulatory, but a comparatively deregulatory approach, particularly in new industries. Frankly, I'm not bothered what they do in the car industry and so on. That will be the same for everybody. But artificial intelligence, medicine, all the physiological sciences and so on, we need to get a grip on that, and we're not. We're behind it. The Europeans are ahead of us in AI regulation, for example. And the other element of economic freedom, of course, is tax. And where we're going on that seems to me to be in the wrong direction. I mean, obviously, we've got huge economic transition going on, and it's very unpredictable. And we need to understand plainly what we're trying to do. First off, you've got a debt probably now close to 100% of GDP.
There or thereabouts,
of which about 400 billion, about 40% of it, no, less than that, but 400 billion of it actually is like a war loan. And
COVID expenditure.
It's COVID expenditure, that's right. Both the explicit expenditure, the sort of subsidies that the government quite properly used. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that in the emergency situation. And it's sort of like a war loan. As I say, after 1918, we had about 200% of GDP in debt. After 1945, we had 250% of it. Both of those were basically paid off in the last decade. And that's where we need to place ourselves now. I mean, I was slightly critical of the government on this. I thought they should earlier start creating the long bonds and so on that were necessary, because it would be cheaper. The longer we wait, the more the interest rate goes up, the more inflation uncertainty goes up, the bigger the premium you have to, and so on. So the quicker we do that, the better. But also it's an intellectual exercise of sterilising that. You know, we shouldn't be trying to balance the books in the face of still ongoing COVID penalty. Indeed, I mean, the Chancellor and indeed the Prime Minister described themselves as Thatcherites, as low tax Conservatives. At the same time, we're putting taxes up. The justification for that is balancing the books. Well, most people would balance the books over an economic cycle. They wouldn't balance it in 1 year in which you're in a depression, which is we're coming out of a depression where we are now. So that's the first problem. Intellectually separate the COVID costs from the normal ongoing business, and then think, what do you want? And what I want is a growth-based economy, because of all those things I described earlier, the world is going to get much more competitive about capital flows, about technology, about the exploitation of technology. All that's going to demand that we pull business to us, we pull brain power to us and so on. So the lower the taxes are, whether it's individual taxes, and I'll talk about those in a minute, or whether it's corporation taxes, the lower they are, the more attractive we are going to be. We are a very attractive place anyway, remember. We have the huge, I'd say the biggest competitive advantage in the world is our language. You know, it's the language of science, language of media, language of programming. You know, if you're going to learn to
good legal system as well.
Legal systems, you know, right across the board, entertainment and you know, if you're going to learn programming in your Chinese, you've sort of got to learn English first.
Sure.
You know, so there's huge advantages there, which means, you know, we can exploit our position. So right, come back to what we're doing now. Well, in the last year, because of political drivers, and most particularly the need to increase funding of both National Health Service and social care, the government estimated that would cost about £12 billion. And so they said, right, we'll pay for that with a national insurance increase. However, firstly, I mean, I never really believe the sort of spreadsheet arithmetic that the Treasury comes up with. We crank in the increase at one end and out we get the 12 billion, because it hits growth. And if you wanted to pick a bad tax in terms of impact on incentives to employment, both as the employee wanted to work harder and incentives to get employed, the employer wanted to do it, an impact on effective demand, because it's going to go straight into or it's come straight out of, more accurately, their wallets when they're going shopping. In all sorts of ways, it is a very bad tax, but it's a politically popular tax. This came about, I think, because really with funding the health service, people think the national insurance payment goes into the health service. It doesn't.
It's a general tax now.
And so it's popular, but it's not a very good tax from the point of view of delivering a good combination of growth and revenue raising. So that's where we start. I was against it in the first place. I was one of the ones who abstained. There were 54 people either abstained or voted against. 10 voted against, 44 abstained, because voting against a financial measure is quite a big deal. But we were against it from the beginning, so were a number of others, people like John Redwood and other thoughtful people on our back benches. Now, however, I mean, we thought it was bad at the beginning, but now we've looked at what's actually happened with the national accounts, and we are actually, well, first thing to say is the Treasury has a historic record of
never being right.
Well, actually, now you say it, one of my first questions from the back benches after I'd stood down from Theresa May's government was to actually ask some poor, unfortunate Treasury Minister, when was the last time a Treasury or a Bank of England forecast was right? And when the House had stopped laughing, the poor man got up and said, well, actually, never.
Never, yeah.
But they tend to be on the pessimistic side. They're a bit like Neil Ferguson's forecast of COVID. It's on the pessimistic side a lot of the time. And that's what we've seen here. At the last budget, they had to adjust the forecast upwards, in an improving direction by 50 billion. And then since then, since the setting of this policy, it's got better in the first 9 months by another 13 billion. It's a nice round number because it's almost exactly what
the amount that they say they need for health and social care.
So just on the basis of the accounts, we should not do that.
Got it. I want to unparcel some of the points you've made. So let's. start with the broad state of the public finances. And I have a huge amount of sympathy for your view that the COVID expenditure, we can argue forever and a day whether it was wisely spent or whatever, but it's a one-off emergency.
Doesn't matter, it's behind us.
Yeah, hermetically seal it and pledge to pay it back over a period of time, fine. But that's the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? I mean, the real worry, even if we hadn't had a COVID pandemic, is the state of the public finance is pretty grim. You mentioned that the national debt is roundabout terms 100% of GDP.
Yeah.
But look at the trajectory, look at the demographics, look at the unfunded liabilities. Nick Silver, for us, calculates and updates those every year. He thinks that could be 500% of GDP, there or thereabouts, in public sector pensions costs, all of the things we promised, triple lock, state pensions and the rest. So I'll grant you, let's sort of put aside the 300 billion, 400 billion, whatever we spent on COVID, we'll pay that off, presumably by running surpluses over the next period of time.
Over time, yeah.
But I thought that even if you were a Keynesian, the idea was that you save in the good times, and then when the bad times like COVID hits, well, of course there's a deficit. Exactly. But actually, we've got into the cycle of living somewhat beyond our means in the good times and radically beyond our means in the bad times. Yeah. This is the trajectory I'm worried about, notwithstanding that we can hermetically seal the COVID money. I'm right to be panicked, aren't I?
Slightly right to be panicked. I mean, this is not a new problem. I mean, when I was Public Accounts Committee Chairman, around about the 2000-ish, we took through a bill. Unusually, a select committee was involved in an act of Parliament to what's called a resource accounting bill, and it was trying to get the accounting basis of government out of sort of basically like a cash till accounting, like keeping half the money here and that sort of thing, into a more modern state. But the one thing I could never persuade the government to do was to do a proper capitalisation of forward liabilities. This is what you're talking about, basically. And actually, the numbers haven't changed that much. They're still about 500% they were roughly then. And that's why the government wouldn't touch it, because I think they thought they'd panic the financial markets. But the financial markets know as well as you and I do.
It's not a secret. It's just not on the...
They know as well as you and I do. But they didn't want the political pressures that would flow from that. So that is true. But it's true for every single country in the world. What it means is that we have to think of ways of bringing that, as it were, implicit debt under control. Now, that will be all sorts of things will affect that. You're already seeing some bits of it. That's why the government is gradually increasing the age of retirement. You know, I mean, I'm 73. I'm fitter than my father was at 40. You know, so those sorts of things can happen. You're going to see transformations in society with people being looked after at home much more. Technology is going to help with that. So there's going to be a whole series of things. But the truth is, I lived through, the first time I ever came to the IEA was just before Thatcher. That's the way I tend to think of it. And at that time, we always thought we were doomed for other reasons. You know, socialism was going to win.
The trade union power.
Trade union power was going to dominate society. Britain was in permanent decline. Our job was to manage that decline. And she took it and she turned it around. I mean, not all at one big go, but in salami slice after salami slice after salami slice. Huge strategic aim, but cut it into small pieces and then achieved it. And we're going to have to do the same with these problems. We're going to find people, we're going to look, working environments and working methods are going to transform dramatically. My point about the latter part of the IT revolution, or the comms and computation revolution, is exactly right. It's going to go on and on. We're going to have to see an increase in the productivity, literally, of every person in the country. One of the reasons, to come back to the tax issue, I think low tax is a good idea. A sort of low tax, high tech economy is the most productive option you can go for strategically. And so, yes, there is this huge looming problem. We mustn't forget it's there, but neither must we let it panic us into a strategy which doesn't work. If we were talking the Treasury mandarins say, we mean put taxes up. Wrong answer.
No, I would agree with you on that. What I'm worried about is, and there's no particular policy I'd point to. I oppose the Nix rise, like you, but there's a continual drip of policies, not just from this administration, from previous administrations as well, that are taking us in exactly the opposite direction to the one that you've outlined and that you and I would like. Whether it, I mean, I think on some estimates, and I know you can, there are different measurements of it, but in broad terms, we now have the highest tax take as a proportion of GDP since Clem Attlee's socialist government.
Right.
I mean, this, we have, it's harder to measure, but the quantum and complexity of regulation has gone up and up and up year on year. More regulations come in every year. It's hardly surprising that we have low productivity. We're all spending our time going around complying rather than producing. Well, so, I agree with your agenda, but do you agree with my concern that inch by inch the trajectory seems to be in the wrong direction, whether you're looking at regulation, future spending, higher taxes, it's all slightly slipping away from us, isn't it?
Yeah, it has to be. And it was one of the reasons I was in favour of Brexit, because it gives us more freedom to do something. Now, if you go out to any political audience, even a conservative one, and you start talking about deregulation, people get nervous. They think you're sort of thinking of a sort of Mad Max economy with eliminating all the safety regulations. Mm-hmm. You don't need to do that at all. But you need to say to yourself, okay, how are we going to deal with this? If you're a car manufacturer, the regulations part of the cost of business is not a big deal. If you are a small company, things like IR35, the tax...
This is the self-employment.
That's right. Tax complexity is a big burden in its own right. New regulations are more dangerous than old ones because they're more difficult to cope with, which is why I say actually we should have a regulatory strategy which focuses on the regulations for new businesses. Now, the advantage we have, however, post-Brexit is what's the great single political win post-Brexit? It's the vaccine.
Yep.
And that was a marginal deregulation which gave us 3 or 4 months of advantage. If we'd still been the EMA, it would probably been a 6-month advantage because our doing it quickly pushed them ahead.
Yep.
And so we can turn around the public and say, actually, deregulation can make you safer if you do it right, if you're sophisticated about it. And I think we need to pick up those parables and run with them. But the other thing I'd say to you is this. You're right about the overall tax burden going up and up and up. As you say, it's approximately a 70-year record. But ask yourself, what is the only way out of that? The only way out of that is growth. Literally, there is no other way to escape that. We have to get a bigger economy to be able to carry the existing state. And when people talk to me about, if you want to cancel, let's say, the NICS increase this year, what are you going to do next year? I say next year I'm going to grow the economy. Because that's the only way you're going to pay for the health service of the future. It's the only way you're going to pay for social care. It's the only way you're going to pay for education. If you don't have growth, none of it's affordable.
All agreed. Do you think, though, within the public spending envelope that we need to take a long, hard look at it? Again, there's supposed to be a kind of comprehensive spending review, but there doesn't seem to be an appetite to cut anything. And again, as you were saying, David, if you sort of talk about deregulating, people assume it's a Mad Max. In a minute you talk about cutting public spending, people assume that you're sort of willfully wanting people to starve in the streets. Yeah. But surely there are huge areas of government expenditure we should look at. I mean, if you were to look at, say, the welfare bill, I think on a rough calculation, I'm just measuring transfer payments here, including the state pension, though, which is a very big part of it. You're looking at a welfare bill just moving money from one cohort to another of something in the region, I think it's £12,000 per household per year. If there was no overhead costs, you could put £12,000 through the letterbox of every household in Britain at the start of the year. With that sort of expenditure, why is there any poverty in the UK at all? I mean, presumably 80-90% of households don't need any support. So you've got, 100,000 for the poorest household. Somewhere, as Ronald Reagan said, there must be some overhead. And it seems to me there's just an area where surely within that budget you can crack poverty if you do it a different way at a lower cost.
One thing I'll guarantee you, the state, which is voracious, the state and the leaders of the state will never come to you and say, we want a tax increase to pay for some more overheads.
Yeah.
They'll come to say, we want more healthcare or whatever. But no, you're right. And I think one of the things we do have to do is have a structural look and a really big, deep look at the spending patterns of our state. Because there's a fair amount of inefficiency, to say the least. I was Public Accounts Committee Chairman for about 4 or 5 years. And I often say when I'm talking to audiences, having sat there and interrogated the Sir Humphrey Applebys of of the people who actually run the country, the permanent secretaries. After 5 years, difference between you and me is you think Yes Minister's a comedy. I know it's a training film. That's the way it feels. But there's another thing as well in terms of the attack on policy. And this will probably be controversial with some of your viewers, but so I asked them to sort of follow it right through to the end. Something like net zero, right? Now, all right, lots of people want to achieve net zero, fine, but sometimes there's a huge difference between the cost of being number one and, let's say, being number three. You're still in the top quartile, indeed in the top decile, right, of what people are achieving. Our tiny economy, not that tiny, but it's 1% of the world economy, it's not going to change the fate of the world if we come second or third. But the cost of doing it is going to get dramatically cheaper. I mean, look at the cost of photovoltaic cells have come down dramatically. Those who, like me, who bought them early, got a lot of money, probably 10 times what I pay today. Look at wind farms coming down. Hopefully tidal energy. All these other things, the costs are coming down as more and more people adopt them. But if we are literally insist on being in the front row, as it were, for headline reasons, then it will cost more. And who will pay the cost? It won't be the rich. It'll be the ordinary person paying their fuel bills.
But here you've got another example, okay? I can see all of the rational scientific evidence for decarbonisation. I'm not CO2 can have bad atmospheric effects. But I'm not aware. I asked Rishi Sunak at the Conservative conference when I interviewed him to put a price on getting to carbon net zero, but he wasn't able to put a price on it. No. It's huge. Now, you're right. I can imagine that as technologies improve, it may become cheaper. But on the flip side, doing your first 10% of decarbonisation is a lot easier than squeezing out the last 10%. It's a bit like getting 5G. You can probably get 5G to 90% of the country quite easily. 95% is a stretch. 99% difficult. That last 1% extremely expensive. So here is another exercise. And let's just assume, for the sake of argument, absolutely necessary in order to prevent the apocalypse, just for the sake of argument. Huge cost, where we're not willing to make a trade-off to say, well, we're going to go for carbon net zero. I'm afraid that's going to mean we've got less on healthcare and education. We just have to do that because we need to save the planet. That's more important than health, education, pensions or whatever. No sense of a trade-off in our public finances. That's what troubles me. It needs to be more of everything. Yeah,
well, that's certainly true. And by the way, I don't think it's necessarily a sort of exponential curve. Depends what you're doing. And I mean, some of it requires imagination. I'm a big fan of carbon capture, which we haven't used, the sort of resources we have, with holes under the North Sea in some respects, that we haven't done. So, yeah, of course it's difficult. And, you're not going to get politicians to say to an audience, well, you've got 3 bags of goodies here. I'm only going to give you one. You don't get elected that way. So I'm afraid that democracy does push us in that direction. But it doesn't, I still don't think at the end of the day that we are unable to address this. Bear in mind, we are phenomenally wealthy. Just off the back of compound interest, brutally, in the last century. We've had a whole series of revolutions, from the sanitation revolution to the electrical revolution to the IT revolution, and all post-industrial revolution. So there's huge amounts we can do, but what it takes is year-on-year determination. Every single year, it takes a determination to make sure that you are keeping an eye on the thing that will run away if you don't. Which is why one of my easy comments is when it's not absolutely necessary to increase taxes, it's absolutely necessary not to increase taxes. It's a very simple rule, but we don't obey it.
And let's move on a bit to the deregulation side. You touched on that. I mean, to my mind, the IEA obviously didn't take any corporate position, but a good number of people at the IEA were supporters of Brexit, some even very enthusiastic supporters. And I think the clincher argument for those of us from a classical liberal perspective, and I'm not suggesting this was the bulk of Brexiteers, was, and you touched on it, what an opportunity to deregulate. We'd had, some of them a little farcical, some of them a bit fanciful, but endless stories of how Brussels red tape and regulation, how extraordinary and farcical it was, and, regulating the curvature of bananas and God knows what else. Some of them, I think, were some of them were not true, and actually some of them weren't particularly novel. I mean, I think prior to entering the EU, we had British regulations about the acceptable curvature of fruit before we joined the European Community. But nevertheless, the overall narrative, and it was an attractive one, I think, was there's a whole bunch of bureaucracy and rules out here which are a mixture of petty, silly, burdensome, troublesome, jobs-worthy. And so my view was, right, well, that's a very good reason to leave, but only if you are going to deregulate. Now, you've got to distinguish between the stock and the flow, and I'm with you. Yeah. Once you've abided by the regulation that determines that you've got to have an elevator installed in your office or whatever, and it's got to be, once you've paid for it, that's a sunk cost in large ways. But surely we can do something with the stock. And why do you have any confidence that we will be saner than the European Union in terms of the flow? I mean, it seems to me this government is extremely keen to regulate everything. I know this wasn't at the high tech end, but we're going to ban online advertisements for jam as part of a public health drive. This doesn't strike me, if that speaks to the nature of the beast, that doesn't strike me as a government that's keen that every opportunity to exploit new tech, no stone is left unturned, quite the opposite.
No, I mean, and the truth is, I mean, what you've got in Brussels is you've got a machine in which, and it's not a particularly democratic machine, because basically all these ideas for regulation come together, and then there's a huge industrial structure that feeds into it. Whereas the argument back here is it will at least be democratic if it's brought before the House of Commons. But no, it's not always. It's no guarantee we'll do it better unless we set about it in the right way. I mean, I gave, and of course, one of the things that the reason I picked the Mad Max example is because that's what the French thought. The French thought these Anglo-Saxons, and I gave a speech in actually it was in Austria, it was rather appropriate for Austrian economics, but I gave a speech saying, look, this is not about a race to the bottom. In some ways, it's about a race to the top. It's about having elegant, well-designed regulation, not badly designed regulation. So, to give you an example of badly designed regulation, is GDPR.
Yeah, sure.
I am the world's fiercest defender of privacy. Heaven knows how many sacrifices I made in my parliamentary career to defend people's privacy. And yet GDPR is bonkers. It's just heavy-handed, clumsy, doesn't really do the job very well either, and so it's quite a good example of how this is about elegance in regulation in some ways as much as deregulation. It's about making it easier, cheaper and more effective. And that's why I'm concerned about something like artificial intelligence. We are one of the world's leaders in this particular area, and we should have been at the front, as it were, getting our regulation sorted out before anybody else is, as we were with vaccines. In fact, we aren't. We're not really there, and the Europeans have done it, and you bet your bottom dollar, and the Americans are doing it, and you bet your bottom dollar we're going to be catching up and adopting theirs. So we have to have a systematic strategy to deal with it. And as I say again, it doesn't mean less safety, it doesn't mean less privacy, and so on. There are loads of things we can do. And by the way, because of the nature of our state, if we're clever about it, it will actually give us an economic advantage. I'll give you a single example. We have, because we have a nationalised healthcare system, we have more medical data around that is accessible, if you like, than almost any other country in the world. In fact, probably any other country in the world, because any other competitor would be America or possibly China. China doesn't compete in this area at the moment. So, but it's a huge privacy issue. If they put your and my medical records online, we might not be very happy about it.
No, exactly.
So, we can do this, and we actually have brilliantly good scientists in this country, and mostly at Oxford, who now know how to do this safely and effectively. And we ought to create the regulatory standard for the world in this. And it's
to anonymise the data, but still yield the scientific research benefits of it.
What it does is, no, it doesn't. You can't anonymise medical data. What it actually does is turn the whole, and this is why it's clever, it turns the whole problem on its head. So instead of me getting all the data and then looking at it, it requires me to set up a hypothesis in a program and send the program into the data, and it comes back with the answer.
Right.
Very clever, and 1,000 times simpler.
Yeah.
So you see what I mean? If we are smart about it, and we're determined to do it, determined to lighten the burden of regulation, we can be a world leader.
Let's come back to the tax point. Where do you think we're going to end up with on the next rise? Is it a done deal now? Of course, just a few days ago, the Chancellor and the Prime Minister co-penned a piece in the Sunday Telegraph.
Yeah.
You referenced it at the start, saying that they are tax-cutting Conservatives and Thatcherites. Well, you could have fooled me.
Well, that's what they said about themselves.
Yeah.
I mean, I am always reminded of St. Augustine, the famous line about "Give me chastity and give me continence, but not yet." Well, these are tax Augustinians. We are the Augustinian tax cutters. One day we'll do it. Well, actually, no. The trouble is, you have to do it as soon as you can, because if the state collects money, it will spend it. One of the things I noticed as a Public Accounts Committee chairman was, the Department of Health got quite a big increase under Blair, and they were scrambling to spend the money in the last 2 or 3 months of the year, so their budgets didn't get cut the next year. So you've got to be very careful to keep the state under control, and that's not by raising extra money, or unnecessary extra money.
So, but do you think it will go ahead? You mentioned there were 50 or so Conservative rebels. Could it actually be defeated in a parliamentary vote? The Labour Party is opposed to it.
If the scope arises, and it's a question of what bills go through the House in the next 2 months, because that's when it's done. It's a done deal by then, really. And if there's an opportunity, then it may well be that Tories who want to do this and the opposition who don't like it will carry it through. But it's a long shot now, I'm afraid. I mean, the truth is, if the Prime Minister and the Chancellor agree on something, it's tough to
pick it,
even if they're plumb wrong, as I think they are in this case.
Yeah. Do you think it's strange that we now seem to have got ourselves into a position where the Labour opposition's key economic critique of the Conservative government is that taxes are too high?
Oh God, it's an astonishing position. I mean, what people should realise, I think, is, I spent a lot of time during the last election going around 16 of the red wall seats. I've talked to hundreds and hundreds of people on doorsteps, switch voters, and the primary reason for them switching from Labour to Tories was essentially a fear of Jeremy Corbyn's tax plans. I mean, Brexit was important,
which your party has now implemented.
Well, in essence, that's the risk. That's how they'll see it. If you're a welder or a bricklayer or a heavy goods vehicle driver, and you're probably better off than most people in your street, but you watch the pennies, and you want to save up for your nice holiday in the summer. Now we can do them again, all of that. You're not going to be very happy to have something like 10% of your disposable income disappear, which is what we're looking at, really. At the same time as you've already had a big increase in your fuel cost, but you've got another 700 quid a family, thereabouts, coming on the back of it. You've got general inflation now at the highest level for at least 30 years, 6-7%. All these increasing costs, if you're well off, it doesn't hit you. But for most families, they have to budget, and they will feel this.
And there's a sort of tipping point around the just about managings, and if you are counting the pennies, that's got an awful lot harder.
Just about managing, and I think her family history sort of taught her that, as mine did me.
And we're tipping these people into the not quite managing.
Or having to make unnecessary economies, or feeling under pressure, and being under financial pressure is not very good for your mental health either.
True.
So, and against that, you're trading off. Well, we're going to have a levelling up agenda. We're going to spend money in your part of the world, and so on. Well, if I'm a lorry driver living in Wakefield, I want first to have my own budget okay, and then maybe I'll be quite happy if they build a new railway station or whatever it might be. But first and foremost, it's my own budget. I mean, what Conservatives believe and what economic libertarians believe is that the individual can spend their own money most of the time better than anybody else. There's only some limited community areas where that's not true, and I worry. I just worry that we may be damaging the reputation of the tax cutters brand, as it were. I was around during the ERM crisis when the Conservative Party destroyed its economic reputation for a decade. And that's despite handing over, and I quote the chief economic advisor to the Prime Minister of the day, handing over the best economy that any incoming Labour government
could inherit.
And we handed over a good economy and our reputation at one go, and that was really clever. I don't want us to do that again.
It's interesting what you say about the levelling up agenda. I haven't quite. I get a bit frustrated with these political catchphrases. The levelling up agenda. David Cameron had the big society, didn't Tony Blair had the stakeholder society?
Yeah.
And sort of, people, you get these sort of strokey beard meetings where everybody sits around and tries to work out what the hell it means. And it's not obvious to me what it means, but it does seem to me a very unimaginative way of addressing some of the poorer left behind parts of the United Kingdom. It is, let's lob money at them. It is regional development funds. There are a few things the government's doing where I think they could be a lot more imaginative. Free ports. Why don't we... I actually only want one enterprise zone called the United Kingdom, but I'll compromise.
Meanwhile,
but meanwhile, perhaps in these areas that have not had a particularly good few decades of economic growth, maybe we could, make employment easier, taxes lower. None of that's happening. It's just I'm going to build you a new roundabout.
Yeah, part of the difficulty here is just straight politics. Look, I am, alongside people's civil liberties, I really care about social mobility, about ordinary kids. We are now, when I went through school, we had one of the best social mobility records in the world. It's now amongst the weakest of the developed nations, not the underdeveloped ones. But, and that's a real tragedy in my view. So that, if it's going to address that, fine. But I don't see much sign of that yet. As for the funding, the difficulty is that the tendency is to try and throw the money at the seats you want to win, rather than put the money in places where there is a good general economic return. And so, for example, I'd never build a bridge over the Irish Sea, waste of money. I wouldn't have built HS2. HS2 is going to cost at least 100% more than they're currently estimating. And it'll do the reverse of what they intend. It'll bring business to London. It won't take it to the provinces. But that being said, Treasury rules have been slightly bent out of shape in terms of they prevent public investment in the provinces and favour the southeast. Now, what that means is there are quite a few public investments around, if you look for them, that will deliver a very good economic return and therefore a sort of tax return, not directly to what you're investing, but more generically. The best example I like was one that was highlighted by Sebastian Payne of the FT, and he wrote a book about these parts of Britain. And it was a railway line between Burnley and Manchester, and there was a thing called the Todmorden Curve. It had been closed down under Beeching. For 10 or 15 million quid, they cut the travel time from Burnley to Manchester, which then liberated the housing market of Burnley, which at that point nobody wanted to live in Burnley. Then all of a sudden they did, and they could work in Manchester. Now, if you can find things like that, then it's perfectly proper to debt finance.
But they're spectacularly unglamorous, these things, aren't they? Politicians want the grand projet.
They're not Roman amphitheatres. They're not, as you say, not grand projects. They're not millennium bridges and so on. They are practical, common sense stuff where there's a weakness. Normally, these things end up as debottlenecking something. I know it's a horrible phrase. But, if you wanted to spend money on railways, you should have said, OK, let's put an extra line on the East Coast Railway. So every time something breaks down, it's not a 7-hour delay for everybody else, That's sort of, as you say, unglamorous, gritty, practical stuff. And you know what? My lorry driver and my welder would understand that.
Yeah.
They may not have a degree in PPE, but they're just as smart as you and me when it comes to practical common sense things.
That's really interesting. Do you think, therefore, for you as politicians and your parties to work out the electoral dividends, that's not the role of a think tank, but is there some, I don't know, not quite silver bullet, but overarching principle that you would like to see the government adopt? Let's say we're going to look at everything through the lens of its impact on economic growth, and we're going to have a dash for growth. And, we really care about getting the growth rate back up to 3% over the long term. And anything that might get it from 1.5 to 1.6 would be warmly welcomed. That's what's going to govern our approach to everything. First and foremost, that's the ace of trumps. Would that be a way of doing it? Or should there be in mind, I don't know, an optimal tax take? Maybe it should only be 25 or 30% of GDP and have a 10-year plan of trying to get there. Because at the moment, now I appreciate COVID literally was this, but with Brexit and COVID and more generally, one has the impression, I think, of just sort of crisis management. A problem comes along, we'll try and fix it, we'll spend money on it. It's extremely difficult to discern a strategy. Yeah. What would the DD strategy be?
I mean, I'd sort of steal it. I'd plagiarise it, frankly, from David Frost, whose point was generally that we are not exploiting the opportunities of Brexit. But let's also come back to your question about the sort of hidden balance sheet, and take a sort of war loan approach to that. 250% of the GDP was gradually paid off over 50 to 100 years. Why? Because we had huge growth. Why did we have huge growth? Well, huge growth. We had reliable long-term
3%-ish sort of.
Yeah, it's a little less now, but that sort of order. And that came about partly because of free trade, partly because... So firstly, I'd like to see a strategy which says, yes, this is based on growth. One of the things the Treasury often underestimates is tax buoyancy. Just the relationship between growth and the tax take. And tax buoyancy is really quite sharp. It's really quite sensitive, to growth. And so, I would build a strategy around that, that we're going to pay for today's liabilities and the future's liabilities by gradually seeking to change the ratio between the private sector and the public. Not that we want to shrink the public sector, not at all. We want to deliver the public services, but the best way to deliver the public services is have actually a bigger private sector that can afford it.
Sure, I mean, it might be a lower proportion of the economy, but it could be a bigger slice of pie because the pie is so much bigger.
It might be. I mean, look, the country that did this in reverse, it was the 60s onwards, I guess, was Sweden, where it got to a point where its public burden was too big, and it hit its growth rate for a long time, and then it sort of woke up and changed, and now it's one of the more successful countries in the world because it puts economic growth high up the agenda. And I pick Sweden because it's a social democratic country, basically, even when it has the odd quirky Tory in charge, one of whom was a friend of mine. He's basically a social democratic Tory. They put social aims very high up the agenda, but they know they've got to pay for them and they can deliver it. So you start by how you pay for it.
It's quite interesting. I'm a bit more familiar with Denmark, and again on the spot price,
not that different.
Not that different, but you'd sort of say expenditure is a high, public expenditure is a high proportion of GDP there, but there are quite a lot of liberal things about these countries, classical liberal things. I mean, Denmark is not a very heavily regulated economy. No. The employment market is not very heavily regulated. No. They've got very generous welfare. Yeah. A lot of their spending is just transfer payments. They're not trying to run a gigantic nationalised healthcare service. They're just moving money from cohort to cohort. So I think there are quite a lot of liberal lessons there.
We can learn some lessons. I mean, I think after COVID, we're going to have to think a bit about how we organise a health service. I mean, we want a very effective health service at the moment. In some of the areas, cancer survival rate, some types, not all, some types of cancer survival rate where we're in a sort of bottom quartile of Europe and so on. We can learn some lessons from our European colleagues, partners and friends, And you're right, Denmark's a determinedly individualistic country. I mean, it was the one, other than Britain, the one that always caused the European Union
the biggest trouble. Yeah, I agree. So maybe we can learn some of the things from Denmark. Now, I'm going to finish, David, by asking you, how sort of optimistic are you feeling? I mean, we've said that, and it's been a very weird period in politics with the whole Brexit battle, and no sooner really was that done and we're plunged into a global pandemic. But we've sort of shared our scepticism, disappointment, I suppose, about the present apparent trajectory. Are you confident this tanker will be turned around, or is it going to be like the first Director General of the IEA said in the mid-1970s, cheer up, things can only get worse. And I think he meant from that, actually, things would have to get really bad before some radical thinking was actually applied to government.
Well, it's interesting you pick that, because it won't happen automatically. That's the point to bear in mind. I mean, I knew your first Director General, and he's a very great man. And it was in this building that the Lego blocks that made up Thatcherism were forged, and then she put them together and made it work.
Yeah.
And you're right. It happened because we were a country that was in decline, that we had strikes, that all these things. A previously great country had seemed to become so troubled, and we got it. We eventually got it right. And I think what we've got in the next couple of years or so is a lot of argument to be had about how we run the grand economic strategy. At the moment, I've not heard a Treasurer, or any other minister for that matter, a Treasury Minister or the Prime Minister, talk about what the economic strategy is for exploiting our freedoms post-Brexit. But it has to happen. And that's why the IEA is important, and other think tanks too, but it's very important that we come at this with a good, solid philosophical base grounded in all that's gone before. A lot of these problems we've seen before, and we can deal with them in similar ways, but also grounded with an eye on the future and say, look, as we started talking before about, let's say, social care, social care may be completely different in 20 years' time, and we have to think that through too. So there's, listen, we are as well off as we've ever been, despite COVID, as a country, as individuals. My life is 1,000 times easier than, let's say, my grandfather's life was.
Sure.
He never lived as long as me, for a start. So there's lots and lots and lots of debate to be had, and real argument to be had for the welfare of the British people, because that's what it's all about at the end of the day. The test of this is, how does my lorry driver, my welder, and his wife and their children, and his wife probably goes out and works in a surgery or
sure.
How do they get the best out of life for themselves and their family? And the answer is not always obvious, but this place where we're sitting has been good at delivering quite a lot of them in the last 50 years.
David, on that upbeat and very pro-IEA note, we're out of time. Thank you very much for joining us for this IEA In Conversation event. If you've enjoyed this discussion, please make sure you hit the thumbs up just below. And if you're not yet subscribed to the IEA London YouTube channel, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That will mean you keep up to date with our weekly updates and our nearly daily updates. So thanks very much for joining us for this In Conversation. We'll see you again very soon. Over and out. Well, if you enjoyed that conversation, why not watch one of these other videos? And while you're here, remember to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell. That way, you'll never miss out on a single IEA broadcast.